Hello there, and a very good afternoon. Welcome once again to our Iran War question and answer session with Professor Michael Clarke. It is the 22nd of April today, Michael. So the war began on the 28th of February. We're now at the point where this ceasefire, as I was just saying to you, I was expecting to talk today about potentially the ceasefire having been agreed. Second round of talks have been held in Pakistan and would be getting somewhere. And I wake up this morning, he's extended it, and I'm not quite sure where we're getting to.
Yeah, still not happened. So this is the 7th extension. I mean, this is not quite a deadline because nothing has been, no other deadline has been established. But he said, we'll wait for a while the Iranian side, who are fractured, which is true, get together a proper proposal. So that gives him gives President Trump a sort of an open-ended idea of another few days. So this is the 7th extension. I suspect that the real deadline is probably about a week away, because in a week's time, this time next week, a lot more military hardware will arrive in the region. So another carrier battle group will be there, the George H. Bush. Another Marine Expeditionary Unit, the 11th MEU, will be there on USS Boxer. And the 82nd Airborne, at least one brigade from the 82nd Airborne will be in place. So there'll be more military hardware in exactly right off the Iranian coast than has existed since 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. Not the same number of troops, but in terms of the ships, planes and drones and all the rest of it, there'll be an enormous force there. And as we've said before in these occasions, you can't keep a force at high readiness for too long. Once the force is there, you've either got to use them or withdraw them. And so I think another clock will start ticking, say this time next week. If it's still open-ended, then this will be the sort of military logistics clock, because already some of the force has been there a long time. The Abraham Lincoln's been there a long time. The Ford has gone through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea. The Ford has been at sea since well before Christmas over Venezuela. And we know that reportedly morale on the USS Ford isn't great because they're putting up with a lot of hardships. The food isn't great. People on the Tripoli, the USS Tripoli, which is one of the assault ships, have been sending back images of the rotten food they're getting. I mean, just not very much, and it's not very appetizing. And the logistics are not catching up with all of this, which is astonishing, to be honest. The one thing that the Americans are always very good at is making sure there's plenty of food for their forces. So this sort of task force can't stay in place for a month or 6 weeks. It's either got to be rotated or stood down or used. So as of now, we're on an open-ended operation to see if there could be a peace talks in Islamabad. And certainly Islamabad's still battened down. The Pakistani government have still got full security measures in place, as if the talks are going to start tomorrow. Now, I don't think they will. It's a 17-hour journey from the United States to Islamabad by plane, and there's no sign of anybody leaving Washington yet. But let's assume that maybe something might happen there in the next 2 to 3 days, and maybe the talks would last maybe 48 hours. I don't think they'd go on for weeks. But we might be looking at something towards Monday or Tuesday next week, which would take the thing on a little bit. But as of now, we're all marking time, while events in the Gulf itself and in the Strait of Hormuz are getting more dramatic.
Yeah, they certainly are, because in the hours after the extension, the Iranians fired on some ships and have seized some vessels. That's our first question, coming from Kate, who asks, how could Iran have seized these ships, and what does that actually mean?
Well, our understanding is, I'm not sure about seized, unless there's some new information I haven't seen yet. They fired on 2 ships today, both of them container ships, and then this Greek commercial ship was attacked and is drifting, apparently. If any Iranian Marines have gone on board, that's news to me.
I'll just bring the line here. The BBC reporting, and others, of course, we are reporting this too. Iran says it seized 2 cargo ships in the Strait, taking them to the country's coast after reports that 3 vessels came under fire. That's coming from one of their One of the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Is that from the Fars news agency?
Noor News.
Oh, the New. Okay, well, if that's what they're saying, if that's the case, I mean, certainly, I mean, as of about an hour ago, I think, we knew that they'd fired on 2 vessels and a third Greek ship had been fired on. If they've seized them, then they'll take them, I'm sure, into Bandar Abbas, because that's the kind of pirate port for what they do. They've done this before. So they'll end up at anchor in Bandar Abbas. Now, that's pretty serious, because that would indicate that is, particularly given that the news source is an official Iranian IRGC source. So it means they meant to do it, not that it was a local commander acting beyond his brief.
How? Because of who has given us the information. In fact, to come from Noor tells us that that's an official.
That implies that this is something that Tehran intended to do. I wondered to start with whether whether that might be the case, because there is a rejectionist front within the IRGC. I mean, a group of IRGC officers who don't want peace at any price with the United States. And you never know, with a devolved command structure, then people may be taking decisions that they think are in line with what the commander wants, but turn out not to be. But if this has come from Tehran, then presumably it's what they intended. And 3 ships, that's too much of a coincidence to be a local commander being a hothead. So undoubtedly the Iranians are upping the ante in the Strait of Hormuz themselves. And in a way they're challenging the Americans to say, what are you going to do about it? They obviously feel very confident. You know, they've held back on going to the talks. They almost humiliated the Americans.
By sending the Americans there and not turning up.
Exactly. Wow. I mean, the Americans were very close to having people on planes to go to Islamabad, and the Iranians say, we're not coming. And that would have been humiliating as well as probably counterproductive. So they're very close to doing that. They look as if they're trying to humiliate the Americans again now by challenging them, because the Americans are a long way offshore. They've got plenty of force in the region, but we now know where they are. I mean, the CENTCOM have said, if you get a map, if you draw a line between the Pakistan coast and the coast of Oman, their ships are on the other side of that line. So, they're a good way away for safety reasons from their own point of view. But that means that it's quite difficult for them to react quickly to this sort of thing. I mean, normally, if they'd been there toward the Strait of Hormuz, they might have been able to stop a ship being seized, but they can't stop it. So this looks like a real challenge that the IRGC are throwing down at a very delicate moment. It'd be interested to see later on today, when Washington wakes up, what the reaction from the Oval Office is to this.
Yeah, just a bit more detail on those ships. So it seems as if at least 5 vessels have been involved in incidents this morning. 3 at least fired upon.
That we know of,
and these 2...
One more seized and
these 2 seized. So they are the MSC Francesca, MSC Epaminondas. They were detained, it's reported here, for operating without required authorization and for manipulating navigation systems.
The Epaminondas is the Greek one, isn't it?
I believe so, right? It would appear to be so. It seems as if they were approached by an IRGC gunboat, and all crew members are said to be safe. There's no environmental impact. So just on the logistics of it, Michael, it's not like they've landed commandos on these ships like the Americans did earlier in the week to that Iranian ship.
And the Houthis had done in the past in the Red Sea. It doesn't sound like that sort of operation.
Picture, didn't we? So this is a case of they send these fast speedboats up to the ship, they tell it to turn its engines on, right?
Yeah, and then somebody gets on board and says, "I'm taking command of the ship."
So they actually do send people on, do we think?
Or if they've seized it, that's what they would have had to do. Somebody climbs up from a very small boat to a very big ship. That's a big climb onto the deck, up to the bridge, with armed men. And you say, I'm taking control of this vessel, and nobody, an armed crew are not going to respond to that. And they just command that the vessel, sail this way, Captain, and we'll take you into, I'm pretty sure it'll be Bandar Abbas. So, but that's a big thing. That's piracy.
Yeah, they're taking it. And as you said, it is to tempt the Americans to do something.
Yeah, something. It was to tweak their tail, to indicate that they are in control, absolute control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the other thing that's emerged, over the last 2 or 3 days, is that this mutual blockade, the Iranians blockading the straits by making them dangerous, and the Americans blockading Iranian ports, neither of those blockades are particularly complete. So today, Vortexa, which is a cargo tracking organization who has no political agenda, was reported, and it's been picked up by some of the press now, that 34 ships have run the blockade, 19 outwards and 15 inwards, and have got through.
Wow.
And so all these ships have been tracked, 19 going out, 15 going in, And neither the Iranians nor and some of them were Iranian tankers, but neither the Iranians nor the Americans have been able to stop all of them. Now, what CENTCOM have said, Central Command, they said that they have turned around 28 ships, and that's, they keep a record, and I'm sure that's true, and they've seized one ship, which was inbound, if you remember. So that's the score, as it were. But as of now, the Americans have accounted for, let's say, 29 ships, and 34 ships have run the blockade in both directions.
Wow.
19 one way, 15 the other.
Just goes to show, I suppose, the slightly slapdash way that this has all been put together.
It's a mess. It's a mess. And it shows there's a lot of sea room here. I mean, we're talking about, the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman. And again, just look on any map, there's an awful lot of sea.
Looking at it right now.
All blockades are matters of degree. I mean, the famous, the British blockade of French ports during the Napoleonic Wars, which is a phenomenal feat of seamanship in a sailing age, where British ships stayed just on the horizon or just over the horizon, and in all weathers, for months on end, they sailed up and down very hard in a sailing ship. And they made sure that everybody in the port knew that they were there. And sometimes they disappeared over the horizon, and sometimes the French tried to break out of the blockade, and occasionally they succeeded, but usually they didn't. Blockades are really hard to enforce unless you're prepared to sit really close inshore and make yourself a target for inshore gunnery or ships or whatever. So all blockades, they always sound more impressive than they are in reality. And the other famous blockade, the Cuba crisis, 1962, and Jack Kennedy declared a quarantine around Cuba, a blockade. First of all, he said 800 miles from Cuba. Then he's persuaded to bring it down to 500 miles. Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, persuaded him. He said, no, bring it to 500 and give the Russians more time to think.
They're on their way before
the blockade. Right. And interestingly, the first ship that hit the blockade, which the Americans boarded, was the Marukla. I always remember that. I used to lecture on this. The Marukla. And the reason they picked the Marukla is they knew it was clean.
Right,
and they went on board and they said, okay, you're clean, you can go. They knew it was clean.
How
and
interesting.
they picked it very carefully to show that they could do it, but not to escalate. Very clever. But in the years since, this idea, the 800-mile blockade reduced to 500 miles, when you look at US Navy records, that blockade was all over the place.
Really?
Some ships stayed at 800, some came into 500, some were in between. It was a very, it wasn't a ring of steel. It was a very porous blockade, and the Americans were lucky that they got away with it and created this sense that they had this ring of steel around Cuba. It's nothing like it.
But they also had, I guess, leadership in Washington and in Moscow.
They did have
able
very
to
careful
talk
leadership.
and think.
And even then, the Russians, I shouldn't go on about this all the time, but the Russians had 4 nuclear attack submarines in the region. The Americans only knew about 2 of them. And we only know now they had 4 submarines, diesel submarines with nuclear weapons on board. And there was that famous incident when one of them was about to release its nuclear torpedo when it thought it was under attack. That was how close they came on that Saturday, the 26th of October. Yeah. Anyways, blockades are very approximate in reality. Yeah.
Question here from Kimbo then, on the IRGC firing these commercial vessels. They ask, why aren't NATO or the Americans now attacking the IRGC in response? I mean, you said we're going to have to wait until the US wakes up. We might see a response to that.
We might, yeah.
But what do you think?
Yeah, one thing I should say, is it Kimbo? Yep.
Yeah.
Is that, with all due respect, it's nothing to do with NATO. I mean, NATO is a European organisation. NATO is not involved in this. And even if NATO nations are interested in what's going on, NATO as an organisation has got nothing to do with Gulf security. It's about Europe. And NATO is making it very clear they're not enforcing this blockade. This is an American blockade in an American war that we are not part of. What NATO nations are saying, like Britain, France, Germany, is that we have a responsibility to international shipping, to keeping sea lanes open, to international law, and we will play our part independently. And I had a briefing last week about where we are at the moment on this international force for the Gulf, and it's very clear that there are 32 nations involved in talks, and talks going on today actually. PGHQ in North London. These military talks are going on today. 32 nations involved. 10 more nations are thinking about being involved. So it's a big group. Britain and France are leading it. The United States is there as an observer.
Interesting.
They don't want the US in this, and the US doesn't want to be in it. And the US is, President Trump is full of contempt and insults for it. But the idea is that as and when this force goes to sea, as it were, or turns up in the region, it will be after some sort of peace deal to enforce a new regime which gets as close to the old regime as possible for the Strait of Hormuz, to keep the Strait of Hormuz as open and clear as it was before the war started.
In the event of peace, though, it's not going to be set to sea at this stage.
But just coming back to the other part of Kimbo's statement, the United States is going for the IRGC. It has done, but we're in the middle of a ceasefire. But as you say, I mean, on the basis of what's happened in the last couple of hours, maybe when Washington wakes up, they'll decide that they do need to respond and, in a sense, break the ceasefire. In a way, the Iranians always seem to be trying to provoke the US into breaking the ceasefire because they think they're in a good position.
Or they endured the weeks of 17,000 or so targets, hits.
21,000 if you include all the Israeli targets, apparently. That's the current total.
And then the threats that he made to destroy their entire civilization,
roundly
rejected around the world. And I think
yes, it was.
Maybe the Iranians have seen something in that threat, the next stage that he would have to take it to escalate if he chooses to, by bombing bridges and power plants, desalination. It's just not something he's quite willing to. They're
not ready to do it. I was saying, talking to Leah earlier on TV about this, that President Trump sees these things as games of cards. So he sees the cards in his hand, he looks at what he thinks of the cards in the opponent's hand, and he tries to work out why they won't give in, because his cards are stronger. So he's playing poker, but they are playing Russian roulette. And so what they are doing is that, they spin the chamber, gun to the head, click. Now it's your turn, Mr. President. Spin the chamber, put the gun to your head. You see, they are playing for their existence, for very high stakes. He's playing for his political future and his place in history, much lower stakes. But they are more fatalistic about it. And they believe they've lived through these things before. They've had the Iraq-Iran war. They've been attacked before. They believe that even though they're playing for higher stakes, that they can tolerate more spins of the chamber than he can. And I think they're probably right about that. And they're prepared to go to the brink of something very, very destructive because they think he's now frightened. He's scared of spinning the chamber again. And I think they could be right about that.
Well, unfortunately, we all have to see who is going to be right in the end. Through all of this, it keeps coming to mind that statement. I think it came from during the war in Afghanistan about the Americans having the watches, but the Taliban having the time.
Yeah, that was a famous phrase.
Right?
You have the watches, but we have the time.
I thought it was a great phrase at the time, remember, because it's about technology and it's about us being here on the land. And I feel like the Iranians have got a little bit of that going on right now.
They have, Asymmetric. And I'll tell you something else, that the Iranians have learned more, or at least more quickly, from the Ukraine war than the Americans have. They've really looked at this Ukraine war, and they've seen the revolution in sixth-generation warfare that we've talked about, robotics. Even though they're only just being introduced into Ukraine, they're making a big difference, and on both sides. And the Ukrainians have been much more alert to this than the United States.
The Iranians.
Sorry, did I say? Yeah, the Iranians, I'm sorry. And whereas the Americans are taking all these lessons on board from Ukraine, they're not implementing them as quickly because they've got such a big military establishment. Whereas the Iranians always knew that they were in an asymmetric relationship with America. And they've brought these things forward much more quickly than the Americans have.
It just shows that they're able to keep doing things despite,
and they've been thinking about this for
of their
several
forces.
years, and they've been really working on doctrinal innovation since 2022.
Question here from Jun Thor. Thor? I hope I got that right. What does Iran mean when it warns it has new cards on the battlefield? I was taken by that as well. And then Jun goes on to say, I'm one of your biggest fans, Professor Clarke. Watching your Q&A session is a real intellectual treat. And he thanks you. They thank you.
Thank you.
And we thank you, Professor Clarke, as always.
Yeah. The answer is I don't know what they mean by new cards.
It was an interesting thing to say, wasn't it? It's like, what, so you're going to bring something out? Or is it this kind of escalation that they seem to be doing, that, we're going to start really teasing you by hitting things in?
Well, if I had to guess, I'd guess it's a series. I mean, I think they're boasting about their asymmetric capacities. As I say, in terms of command structures, they've devolved their command down to a lower level. We know they've got this plan. If all else failed, if they were deposed in Tehran, to move down to 3,000 centres of small units of, sort of 10 or 15 people in a cell structure to frustrate any attempt to build a coherent government after that. Whether it would work or not, we don't know. But they've thought through all of the scenarios right down to their own destruction. in Tehran. And the clear determination is if we go down, we're going to take everything else down with us. And that is this sort of almost nihilistic view, which also relies on the religious fervour with which they pursue their politics. I mean, you say they don't think the way Western politicians particularly think. Some do. And, Iran is a modern, very sophisticated state with a huge, grand history and terrific Persian culture. Yeah. But there is something about the Iranian Revolution which is really at odds with pragmatic, secular Western thinking. And I think this idea of devolving command down to quite low levels, of bringing on all of the sixth generation warfare where they can, I think gives them a sense that they can continue to spring surprises on the United States. And since this war began in 28th of February, the Iranians have made more of the they've set the agenda for the Americans, not the other way around.
Yep.
They look as if they've reacted, but actually, every time there's been another twist in the war, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks, there was a new twist every second or third day, it seemed to be the Iranians driving it. And I think they think that they're still in control of the agenda. So the ultimate answer to that, I'm sorry, is I don't know what they mean by that, but I think it is about new, cheap, sophisticated, low-level systems connected to robotics and remote control that can keep posing problems for the Americans.
I mean, as you said, Michael, they seem to have strategized this war for perhaps decades, thinking about what would happen. And the Americans, under this administration at least, seem to have gone in slightly half measures, not having the MEUs in place.
Not quite knowing what they would eventually have to deploy to get to the point where they are now.
Right.
And the other thing, Kamali, is that all of the leaders now, you look back at their histories, at people like Galibaf and Zolgada, and all these people, cut their teeth militarily in the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988, which killed more than 750,000 people. And that was a near-death experience for the whole Iranian revolution, for the Islamic revolution. And they drew from that the idea that we can survive anything.
Well, they famously sent wave attacks of people.
Yeah, human waves, like the Russians in the Second World War, no weapons.
It's extraordinary.
Human wave attacks. And the idea was, when you see people ahead of you dead, pick up their rifle and you take that. Yeah.
And the revolution survived it. That's the thing.
And they survived it, yeah. And so they've got this sense that we have survived the worst that the world can do to us, so we can survive this. Yeah.
Next question coming from Dieter. So Dieter asks, if Iran blocks the strait, how does it reopen without boots being on the ground? Knowing the US fleet stays in open sea nearby, can we force the door open with just naval power or tech, or is land war the only real option if negotiations fail?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, land war isn't the only option, but the other options all mean lots of continuous engagement. So the three things you'd need to do to open the straits, if by force, is one is that a series of destroyers, these Arleigh Burke destroyers, which are very powerful. And a series of destroyers acting as a gun line. So they've got to go through the straits and sit off the coast and act as a sort of an air defence screen for everything the other side of them.
How many would you need to be able to do that?
Oh, 5 or 6. Okay. I mean, they've got 10 or 15 in the region now.
And they would act as sort of a shield as the ships came in and out.
Exactly, it's a gun line.
Right.
So that's the first thing you need. Then the second thing is that you need protection of the ships themselves, and you have to do mine clearance behind the gun line.
Yep.
So, and you've got to convince the merchant marine that it's going to be safe to go there. They won't put their ships and their crews there unless they think it's pretty safe. And then the third thing, which is the boots on the ground bit, is that instead of boots on the ground, you'd have to have a big air campaign against the land area. So all of that 600-mile coast, all the way up the Gulf, the Iranian side of the Gulf, but apart from, the whole 600 miles you might not need to cover, but you certainly need to cover probably 150 to 200 miles of it. And anything that moved on the coast that looked like a launcher or a truck or a military vehicle, you have to go after it. And that would be a big air campaign. Now, you could do that, but the issue is you probably have to keep doing it. Unless the Iranians were destroyed, unless they fell over in some political sense, then they would always have the ability to pop up. Because if you look at that coastline, it's very mountainous. It's full of caves and crevices, very difficult to police. It's not the other side of the Gulf, the Saudi side, the Bahraini side. That's desert. I mean, that's easy to
see what
police.
you're doing.
Fly up and down. But the Iranian side, luck would have it, is very hard to police. So, and this is the conundrum here. I mean, President Trump is insulting all his NATO allies, saying you haven't the guts to do it. You go and clear the strait. It's dead easy. You can't do it. You're useless. Well, and the answer is, well, if it's so easy, you do it. And the reason they won't is they're scared to. Not that they can't, but that if they do, they'll take losses. If they do, they'll be fighting their way through the Gulf, and they'll have to keep on fighting for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and they'll lose something.
They couldn't do it with the overwhelming air power that they have. You don't think?
No,
or
they couldn't do all of it. That's the point. That's the point. You can't deal with overwhelming air power. Fine, you could do a lot, but can you deal with the submarines, the miniature submarines that the Ukrainians got, the Iranians have got? Can you deal with the fast attack craft, which they seem to have hundreds, which can zip out of little coves at any time? Can you deal with those? I mean, you deal with a lot of them, but not all of them. What about the mines? That we know that they've got thousands of mines, most of which have not been used, and floating sea mines. Dead easy to plant sea mines if they're floating. You just drop them off the back of any old boat, and they just float, and they create immediate danger. Then you have to have mine clearance vessels to get rid of them, and that's straightforward. But you've got to protect the mine clearance vessels.
Yeah.
So all in all, you could do it. But the initiative would always lie with the Iranians to find ways of making it dangerous. So that's the point. The Americans, with all this power, they're scared to go in and clear it themselves because they'd have to fight for it and keep fighting for it, and then they would take some losses just in the normal course of events.
It feels like trying to do that campaign is right on the edge of where sort of AI and automated weapons would be able to take you, because I'm sure that in the times that come, automated weapons would be able to do that far better than we are at this.
I'm sure that's
moment,
true,
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it feels like the campaign that they need to do to make sure that they're able to fulfill whatever war aims they've got is just on the cusp.
It's on the horizon. And the British, we've got a really good counter-mine measure system, which is all robotic. But we've only got one group. There's only about 25 people in it. It's there at the moment, but we need 15 or 20 of these things with 2,000 or 3,000 people operating them. So we've got the beginnings of a system which could do exactly that, which can track robotically and clear channels robotically. And they're outfitting Lime Bay, which is an RFA ship in Gibraltar. It's been alongside a long time to save money. It's now being rushed back into service as a mothership for these robotic systems, which we plan to contribute. But that's great, but it's not ready yet. It's not been tested in battle yet. And we've only got one set of it when we need dozens.
In the event of peace, it would be deployed, though, I guess.
It would. Yeah, I mean, that's the intention. That's the intention. And we'll see how well it works.
I think the Ukrainians have a thing about, things that are tested and then battle tested. And things that are tested are fine. You can test it in a lab or wherever else, but it's when it is actually used.
Oh, yes. And the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians have 4 countermeasure vessels sitting in Portsmouth. 2 of them have been gifted by us, old Navy Sandown, and 2 of them, one from Belgium and one from the Netherlands. We've got 4 of them there. They can't go to Ukraine for mine clearance in the Black Sea because they can't go through the Bosphorus.
The Turks are not allowing them to get
because the Montreux Convention of 1936. They're not allowed through because they're warships. So they're sitting there waiting for the war to end when they can go and clean up the Black Sea. And President Zelensky, always aware of these opportunities, said, look, you can have them. I mean, or you can use them. We'll lend our mine countermeasure vessels to you. And we'll send certainly the 2 British ones. I'm not sure about the Belgian and the Dutch one that have been gifted. I'm not sure if he's in full control of those. But he said the 2 British ones that we've been gifted, if it helps,
you can
have them. And so they may end up back in the Gulf after all at some point in the future. And they're sitting in Portsmouth at the moment doing nothing.
Ready to go, though? They're not being fitted or anything?
I don't think they're ready. It wouldn't take long. They're quite small vessels, and they could be ready quite quickly.
Good question here from Von 007 that I've been wondering about. How long can Iran survive with this US blockade? You mentioned that the blockade is a little porous in places, but I guess that when they see ships that may carry oil that's going to fuel the economy, they're going to stop those ones and might let the other ones through. So how long could it survive if they're to stop oil revenue being made?
I mean, not forever, obviously. And if the Americans are able to stop Kharg Island operating, which 90% of all Iran's oil comes and goes through Kharg Island. And effectively now nothing is coming out of Kharg Island, I think. What the Americans were hoping is that by embargoing transshipments of oil, then the oil storage would be used up quite quickly, but within the next couple of weeks from now. And that backs up in the pipelines and that damages the wells, which it does, as we know. Well, the wells have got to keep pumping. Same problem for the Russians. If the wells don't keep pumping, they get damaged to the point where they're beyond repair very often. You have to dig a new or drill a new well. And the Americans were hoping that that would take place and that would bother the Iranians. And I'm sure it does bother them. And they know that their economy is severely damaged by this war. But my own sense of it is that it won't move them politically for a matter of months, not weeks. I think they'll go for another few weeks before they really feel the effects. And they'll find ways, again, it's a big society, 90 million people. They'll find ways of getting around it. And because they've got such brutal control over the majority of their population, I think they'll continue in immense economic hardship, if necessary, through to the summer and the autumn of this year. I don't think they're going to crack in the sort of timescale that the United States would need them to crack in order to regard this war as in any way successful.
Slightly out of your realms of expertise, but I know you'll have a thought on this. Is the US working up to a deadline? Because the midterms are coming. I've got it in front of me, the 3rd of November.
Yep.
Donald Trump will not want to start to go into campaigning for that with the US in what seemingly a endless war in the Middle East with the Iranians. So they're not going to want this to go into the autumn, are they? So
not at all.
And the Iranians can probably see that and think, hold on a minute, if I can do 2, 3, 4 months.
So when working backwards from November, when does it really hurt them electorally? And you would guess, again, everyone's got a view on this, but you would guess that's going to be really from the end of May, early June, because that's when the adoption process, all Republican candidates to fight in the elections in November, that process began in, I think it was late February, and it finishes. Some of it doesn't go till the end of September, but most of it is in May and June.
Right.
So most candidates are adopted, and most candidates, of course, are looking at President Trump and his endorsement. That gets them adopted. If he doesn't endorse them, they don't get adopted. And that's the way it is at the moment in the Republican Party. Once those candidates are in place, then they may actually start to criticize him a bit more openly. And so you could feel that the campaign trail for him might be, or for the Republicans, might become really difficult if we get towards middle to end of June and this war is either still going on or leaves issues unresolved. Maybe a long-term sort of managed ceasefire with nothing resolved. Then it would start to hurt him because the pain of the war for everybody would be very obvious, and the benefits, or lack of benefits, also obvious. So my guess would be instinct, mid to end of June, before it really would then hurt the Republicans.
Just because I think it's always interesting to do a little check on what you think he's thinking, and I know we never quite know. There is some sense in some quarters that Donald Trump is kind of fatalistic, nihilistic at the moment. He sees this as his last term as long as he sticks to the Constitution, and is willing just to kind of take this to wherever it leads, because he doesn't really care if the Republicans get elected next time, because it's not going to be him.
Yeah, I've read that. Even if they have big reversals at November, he'll explain that in other ways, and that he's undoubtedly he's playing for history now. He's playing for his legacy, but it must be a source of worry to him in the early hours of the morning that this war will define his legacy. Whatever else he seems to stand for in American history, the greatest president ever or the worst president ever, it's going to be one or the other in a lot of people's estimation. Whatever it is, his legacy will now depend on the outcome of this war, more than the tariffs, because you look at the Liberation Day tariffs turned out to be far less severe than he said. When he announced them all, he then ratcheted them all down in individual cases, lots of exemptions and so on. So the tariffs, it was a big hit. It was a foolish thing to do for the world economy, but it's not been as severe as he thought. The ICE, the immigration enforcement, he dialed down on that because it was creating something close to civil war in the United States. He has been successful in stopping immigration from the south, the wall, and effectively, the wall's nothing like complete, but he's made it so unpleasant that people aren't coming. So he's got a sort of a mixed bag on other issues.
Price of eggs.
Yeah, exactly. And that's it, domestic, the economy. Yeah. But this war will define him in history. And, you wonder what it is he thinks he can get out of it. Because the chances of getting out of it, something that looks distinctly better than the 2015 deal with Iran that he wrecked, is looking, is diminishing all the time. He's going to come out. I think he'll come out with something that looks very like the 2015 deal, but worse. That's where I think he's going.
Unless he can stop them from being able to have any kind of nuclear program at all, it is going to be worse, because there was always,
what he said,
there was always a sunset in the JCPOA, wasn't there? And what was it, 10 or 15 years that they were allowed, that they weren't able to be enriching uranium any further than the.
That's right, 3.67.
Right.
It said that you can, for 10 years, 2015 to 2025, you can have civilian nuclear enrichment to 3.67% of highly enriched uranium.
Yeah.
And you can't go beyond that, because that's all you need for a civilian program. And the Iranians thought, well, they agreed to it, thinking they'd be able to fiddle their way out of it. And they couldn't. It turned out that the JCPOA of 2015 was very tight. And the IAEA, which was inspecting it, although they were frustrated all the time by all the games that the Iranians were playing, they didn't get away with anything. And the Iranians only then began to really go for highly enriched uranium when the deal collapsed in 2018, when President Trump pulled America out of it. Then they said, fine, okay. So then they started to enrich uranium, which is why they've now got this 400 and odd, 460, 450, 406, who knows, 400 and something kilos of 60% enriched uranium, which everyone now agrees they've got. And they agree they've got.
Nuclear dust, Donald Trump calls
nuclear
it.
dust, Now, they didn't have that before the deal collapsed in 2018. They've got it now.
So unless he can get it to zero, it's going to be a failure, because it doesn't look like they're going to get rid of their missile program, which is one of his aims. The regime, which is the next question here, has been changed, but it's hardened, hasn't it? So he hasn't been able to give the Iranian people this sense of democracy that he kind of...
The Iranian people are further away now from the regime change that they want than they have been for some time. And, by the Iranian people, we think we're talking about 80% of a 90 million population. So we think that up to 20%, maybe less than that, but let's say up to 20% are regime supporters of one sort or another, and 80% hate the regime and would love it to change. But the brutality of the crackdown in early January, and then the dangers of the war and the fact that the war confuses people as to how they should feel about being bombed by the Americans and Israelis, means that the chances of a popular uprising now are less immediately than they were a year ago.
Yeah.
But my point is that I think that there will be an uprising at some point in the future, because the economy is on the floor. If inflation, when the fighting stops, will be even higher than it was before. People will come back out on the streets. But I think that where we are now is that as and when this change of regime does happen, in months, years, whatever, it will be violent. It'll be very violent.
Question here from Ben R91, kind of tangential to that, Michael. With much of that leadership structure having been assassinated, Ben R91 asks, who has control in the final say in decision-making right now? Is the IRGC trying to consolidate more power? I mean, I love your answer to this, because I think they're just in control, aren't they? IRGC?
They are, yeah. What you had before was a clerical theocracy, backed up by quite a powerful military arm, the IRGC. And remember that there was an army as well, Army, Navy and Air Force, which was the Iranian Army, Navy and Air Force, and then there's the IRGC. And the IRGC also has the Basij, which is the sort of militias, the amateurs who are murderous people, by and large, who run around on motorbikes and are barely in control at any given moment. And taken together, the IRGC and the Basij are bigger than the official army. So the army was never a major factor here. And what we've got is the situation where the theocracy, the autocracy that is the clerics, have now been replaced by a military junta, who are the IRGC. So the military, the hardline military, not the official military, the IRGC are now really in control. And you look at Vahidi, who's now the CDS really of the IRGC, and Zolgada, who we mentioned before, Galibaf, who's the man who's now seems to be prominent. I mean, these really are hardliners. And again, as I was saying, they all came up through the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. And these people are the key decision makers. So the regime now in Iran is now a thoroughly militarized regime. And the other thing that's worth noting here is that the army are 50% conscripts. And they always were.
Yeah.
I mean, in the 1979 revolution, one of the reasons that the army sat on its hands when the Shah was in real trouble politically was because they weren't sure that the soldiers would obey orders, because so many of them were conscripts, because they sort of represent the more popular view. And there is now that sense that the Iranian army and Navy and Air Force, because they're 50% conscripts, are probably more in tune with the 80% of the population. And it's not clear that they would react. About 30% of the IRGC are conscripts as well. But when people are conscripted, they're carefully selected. And if it looks as if they're zealots, then they send them to the IRGC. So the 30% IRGC conscripts are probably fairly loyal. But the 50% of the army conscripts, the official army conscripts, probably are not loyal.
Well, you actually moved on to the next question here, sort of. Alistair asks, is there any truth in the reports that some Iranian soldiers are deserting and moving to Afghanistan?
Don't know. I mean, I've seen some of those reports. Nobody's put any numbers on it. But given what we just said about the number of conscripts in the army, I wouldn't be at all surprised. Because, these, young lads who didn't want to go to the military anyway find themselves in uniform, find themselves in a situation where they might be called out onto the streets to fire on the population or to police the population in ways they don't want to. And quite possibly they've hopped over the border to Afghanistan. Problem is, going to Afghanistan is not such a good idea. They'd have to hide out a bit. But if you think about, if they go towards Herat, which is the very Persian area up in the northwest of Afghanistan, Herat is a wonderful sort of Persian-influenced Afghan city. If they go and hang out in Herat province, they can probably do that for a year or two without too much trouble. But if I were them, I wouldn't go too near Kabul and certainly not Kandahar.
Are they still at war with Pakistan?
Yes.
Afghanistan at the moment?
Afghan and Pakistan are still in a war. Yeah, and it is ongoing. It's not the most serious.
Not one of the ones that Trump has solved.
No. He hasn't addressed that one yet. But no, they're still bombing each other. I mean, the Pakistanis are still bombing Afghanistan, and Afghanistan are still being accused of launching raids in the tribal areas of Pakistan.
Incredible.
Yeah, but if I was a member of the Iranian army, I'd go and hang out in Herat.
Get to Herat. All right, final question here from Breeze, and it's about the Russians. Russia is often described as being a winner of the war in the Middle East due to the short-term increase in energy revenue. But to what extent are they losing overall? They lost the ally of Syria, and they've now got obviously a very weakened Iran.
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of calculations going on at the moment. The Kiev Institute, which is generally very good, and it's not, it's pretty objective by and large, and they produced an analysis of the amount of extra income the Russians were getting from oil increases, and benefits to their trade and benefits to their budget. And very briefly, they said if this war lasts a month, it doesn't make any difference to them. I mean, the higher oil prices neither here nor there. So we've gone past that point. If it lasts 3 months, which is where we are now, it takes the pressure off budgetary consolidation for Russia for the rest of this year. So it means that they don't have to really squeeze their budget for the rest of 2026. If it lasts 6 months, they said, then the amount of income that the Russians will get for it will actually take the pressure off the war economy altogether for a couple of years. It will actually give them cash. And that sort of conclusion was reinforced by the chief of Swedish intelligence, who gave an interview just this week, and he said that if you look at he said the Russians need an oil price, and here we go, our favourite subject, of above $100 a barrel for at least a year before they really get some benefit. But that's roughly consistent with what the Kiel Institute was saying.
Yeah.
If this war goes on for more than 6 months, then the Russians start to turn a corner in the amount of cash that it brings them. Having said all that, the things that are still wrong with the Russian economy, it's still unbalanced. It is assumed, despite their figures, that their inflation rate is closer to 15%, not the 6% that they claim, 5.8 I think they claim at the moment. Most analysts say no, it's closer to 15%. Their interest rates are 15%. The civilian economy is at a standstill, and even their war economy is struggling because it's being kept alive by state banks lending them money because they're told to lend them money. So all of the credit in Russia is going via state-controlled banks into the arms industry, which is literally just sort of churning out stuff without much innovation and without much new investment. So there is a sense, as we've talked about many times actually, that the Russian war economy is on a plateau. It's quite a high plateau, but it's on a plateau. It's not developing. And the oil price, it will matter to them. So a long-term oil price of more than $100 will get them off the hook at the second half of this year. Less than that, and they are increasingly on a hook, which we foresaw last year, that 2026 will be a very difficult year for the Russian economy. I mean, but this war has given them a bit of a lifeline.
It hasn't. Where are we with the US imposed sanctions on them? Are they still paused as well?
On the Russians?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not many have been withdrawn. I mean, these are all sanctions that the Biden administration put on, and before that, which the Obama administration had put on after the 2014 invasion. So most of the sanctions are still on. President Trump has not imposed any new sanctions on Russia, but he does have secondary sanctions on Russian oil going to India and Russian oil going to China. They haven't really implemented the Chinese ones. They've implemented some of the Indian ones, but by and large, the companies that were importing Indian and Chinese oil, hang on, the Indian and Chinese companies importing Russian oil, by and large, have found quite a lot of ways around it.
Yeah.
And like, as we always say about sanctions, you impose sanctions and then you've got to keep chasing them to actually get around all the evasions which people find immediately when they find themselves under sanction.
Yeah, just a few days ago, the Treasury Department extended its pause on sanctions on Russian oil. They obviously did that to try and ease supply when the...
So they're taking sanctions off now. Russian tankers are going around the world with America's blessing, because the Americans are trying to keep the global price of oil down.
Which is floating around $100 a barrel.
Yeah, exactly, about around 100. And the Europeans are maintaining their sanctions. They won't go along with this American policy because they think it's A, immoral, and B, just contradictory.
Absolutely. All right, Michael, we're going to stop it there for this week. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you also for that question on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I know in the comments I've noticed that some of you guys are asking for us to do a Ukraine war Q&A at some point.
I'd love to.
Yeah, I think I'll have a chat with the powers that be and see if we can get one of those in the next couple of weeks, because it is important that we check in with what's happening in Ukraine. Just a note as well, if you heard some weird audio at the beginning, that was me watching us on YouTube, so I heard myself back. So sorry about that, but there was nothing else other than me messing up on my laptop. Look, we appreciate you being with us as always. We will do another one of these next week, Wednesday, same sort of time, and we will try and get a Ukraine war Q&A in the diary real soon.